Yes, it's my fiance. Yes, ma'am.
So Shane just gonna talk to you then?
Yeah, I look down when I talk. I'm sorry, I'm gonna look down the whole time probably.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
So just tell us about the day your fiance and your baby went missing. Like, what kind of day was it? Was it a regular day?
That was just a basic Thursday. We basically have a routine every day. I get up around 6 a.m. and pretty much hit the snooze button a couple times, and then I finally wake up around 6:15, drink some water, wake up the kids around 6:30, wake up Heidi and Silas right before I leave. So like once I got them up on Thursday, it was kind of a later morning. It was around 6:40 whenever I got them up, and because it was Heidi's first day to actually take Margot by herself with Silas. So pretty much gave Heidi a kiss, the baby a kiss, and Silas a kiss, said have a wonderful day. Left the apartment, went to work, and then she takes the kids to school, and she was making lunch like right before I left.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. It is now 6 days since Heidi Broussard has disappeared, along with her 2-week-old infant, Margot. Tomorrow it'll be a week since they've disappeared. It's virtually inconceivable that Heidi herself is out there, aware of the news and voluntarily remaining silent and remaining incommunicado, not only with Shane, but also with everybody else, with her own family, with the media, with the authorities. It's possible that there wasn't foul play, but every day that goes by, it seems more likely that whatever happened to Heidi and whatever happened to Margot was something that they didn't consent to, and something that is more likely the result of nefarious deeds. If that if that is the case, then every day that goes by, whoever is responsible for whatever's happened to them, the pendulum kind of swings towards them in a sense that they gain an advantage over the authorities. Evidence that may be recoverable can be lost, and traces that have been left behind, whether digital or forensic, can also be withered away just by the ticking of the clock. Before we begin the True Crime Rocket Science analysis of the transcript, and we're only going to be looking at about 83 seconds of the transcript. Pardon me, that's 98 seconds, so 1 minute 38 seconds. So we'll be looking at barely a minute and a half of the transcript, and but before we get to that, I just want to be clear that obviously people are innocent until proven guilty, and what we're simply trying to do here is look at the body language and see what that says. Anyone can draw inferences one way or the other, and this is the opinion of True Crime Rocket Science, and it's simply based, as I say, on less than 2 minutes of the transcript. If you find the analysis here interesting, compelling, worth listening to, please leave a comment, like, share amongst your networks, and if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do, and let's get started. So as early as 6 seconds into the interview, Shane does what I call a tongue flick, and some people call it by a different name, licking the lips or whatever you want to call it, but the tongue flick kind of happens almost before anything else happens. And what's very important to do when one does body language analysis is you want to look at the body language in isolation. You want to look at the transcript, what is being said, what is being answered, at what point does the person that's being spoken to volunteer, what often the reporter may be asking a question and they sort of go on and on and on, and then at some point a word triggers the person being interviewed to not necessarily interrupt, but it gets them activated. So you want to look at that as well. You also want to look at the body language, how it fluctuates and how it changes while the other person is speaking. It's not just when they themselves are speaking, it's when they are being asked a question. How do certain words trigger certain movements and certain responses, and how do certain words not trigger that, and in what instances do you see kind of a blank, right? And then of course you want to look at the words that the person is saying and the body language and see whether there's any kind of sync there. Which way are his eyes moving? And that's a very subtle thing that takes quite a few cycles where one needs to listen to it a few times, watch and sort of observe what is kind of going on. So the first thing that I've noticed is the tongue flick, and that's something that I'm very familiar with as a true crime writer. I've written over 90 books, and I've written a trilogy on Scott Peterson. I've written more than 10 books on Chris Watts. I've written on the Ramseys, on the McCanns, on Triple Axe murderer Henry Van Breda, and also Jason Roeder. And when you study all of these people, you notice the tongue flicking. It's not like handwriting analysis, like a polygraph. It's kind of in the area of pseudoscience. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but certainly what you want to look at is when the tongue flick happens, what is being spoken about. You can have a tongue flick happening when someone is just preparing to speak. You can have it when it's someone who's not a criminal, who's simply just getting ready to enunciate in a clear way. But it's that kind of premeditation to answer is also a sign that there's a little bit of tension in the person when a certain kind of question is being asked. Now, you can be innocent and lick your lips because it's something that is fraught in some way, but by the same token you can be implicated or culpable of something, and that's why one is licking one's lips. There may be a sense of pleasure that one has more information than the person asking the question, and also kind of a sense of anticipation that one is now going to one is being given the opportunity now to say what one wants to say, to clear one's name, and there's a sense of delight in that. There's a sense of pleasure that you are now going to convince a lot of people of something when you know possibly that something else is the case. And so the tongue flick is certainly something that you see happening a lot when you study true crime in detail. And so it's quite significant that you see before Shane Carey says a word, there's a tongue flick. I think one's got to see the trees for the wood, in the sense that one's got to be detail orientated when one does body language analysis, You want to see the individual branches and leaves and the tapestry of the forest, but you also want to see the forest as a whole. So you need to look at it kind of microscopically, and you've got to look at it globally, and that the same applies to the psychology, the same applies to true crime as a whole. You want to look at the micro information, you want to look at the whole puzzle and how it fits together, and if it does fit together, and the different dimensions of the puzzle. You know, there's the flat dimension of the evidence, but then there's also backstory and dynamics, and that creates different dimensions to it. So you really want to have a very expansive look and then a very micro look, and all these things kind of need to tie up to one another. So in terms of that, the fact that and this is kind of a global observation, the fact that Carey is looking down the whole time seems to me to say something. And what I mean is, you can argue that he's a shy guy, or that he's an uncomfortable guy, maybe a bit like Chris Watts. But if that was the case, I'm not sure if he would volunteer for one interview, let alone two. He seems kind of just a down-to-earth guy, and he's capable of a little bit of levity in the interview. So it doesn't seem as if he's completely frozen like a deer in the headlights. What I see in that looking down is I see someone who wants to be on camera, but at the same time needs to concentrate on what he wants to portray and what he wants to, the story that he wants to tell. And there's a problem with that already, and the problem is, in a genuine scenario where someone was genuinely missing, you would expect what we call conviction and urgency, and conviction and urgency go together. You would expect someone to want to look at the camera, want to convince the public of whatever their story is, in terms of please find this person. And yet he doesn't start off by making a plea. He basically is passively waiting for questions to be asked and kind of passively answering them, and not even looking at the camera. So in other words, he seems almost submissive, unassertive, yielding, rather than someone who is trying to make a point, someone who is trying to make an appeal. In other words, he seems to be someone who's on the defensive. That's why he's looking down. Now again, if you compare this to Chris Watts kind of stared the interviewer in the eye, and when he was interrogated, with a polygraph and everything, he was also capable of looking at the people asking him questions. Shane Carey isn't even capable of doing that. And one can say, people grieve differently, and that's something that was raised in the recent Oxygen documentary, Criminal Confessions Season 3, Episode 1, dealing with the Watts case, where Rourke said, people grieve differently. But this is too soon for grief. What we should be seeing from Carey is either a guy wanting to be hopeful, wanting to hope that his family are okay, and trying to convince the public to save them if there's the possibility of saving them. But if you look at his body language in a general way, the looking down seems like resignation. In the same way with Chris Watts, where he said, I've tried everything, I don't know where they are, I hope they're going to come home, please come back. There was something like resignation with him as well. There was something in that nonchalance with Chris Watts that seemed like he was resigned to a particular outcome, right? Speaking in the past tense is the same kind of thing. It's different with Carey. What we see with him, it's almost like he's already grieving. It seems like he already has the burden. It seems like he's already accepted the worst outcome. And a lot of that is where he is asked something by the reporter, and we're going to deal with that now, and then his eyes close as if he knows something. And then another aspect that one can look at in two ways is the fact that he speaks fairly softly, especially when he gets choked up. And those are obviously key areas where he's being emotionally overwhelmed simply by uttering a word. And you've got to ask, why is that happening? And the one explanation is that he is attached to these people, and by mentioning their names, he's awakened into the reality that they're missing, right? So in other words, it could just be genuine emotion, but by the same token, it could be a sense of being overwhelmed, but in a more intense way, that there's a lot of memory and there's a lot of intensity and there's a lot of trauma attached to this person's name that he's mentioning, and that's why he's unable to utter it without his voice breaking. In other words, there's far more hiding behind that than just a normal attachment. In other words, there could be a criminal aspect to it. There could be some kind of darkness that he's aware of, and by being in the situation where he's got to talk in public, he's unwittingly looking into that darkness. And so when the female reporter says, tell us basically what happened, right when she says the words what happened, that's when the tongue flick happens. And so that is quite significant. Again, you can read it in two ways. You can say the tongue flick is simply him preparing to speak. He's being asked to tell us. But at the same time, you can imagine if he's guilty of something, then the tongue flick is a nervous licking of the lips. I think Dr. Phil refers to it in a way as someone washing something from their mouth. It's almost like washing something away. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think it's more kind of it's a combination of a nervous response, and also there's almost a sense of salivating at the prospect. So it's almost like a nervous salivating, if that makes sense. In the same way that you symbolically lick your lips, or a cartoon character licks their lips when they're about to eat a nice meal, people also lick their lips with the idea of making a meal of a particular story that may not necessarily be true. That makes sense. And so what is also interesting with this female reporter, she says, is Heidi your fiancé? We just aren't sure. And so this is quite incredible, is that he's already on camera, he's already in front of the camera, he's there to plead his case, and that simple fact hasn't even been established. He hasn't made it absolutely clear to the media what his relationship is with Heidi, and that is that's also kind of a concern. Why wouldn't he have made it completely clear? And in the same kind of sense with Chris Watts, remember, he never mentioned the word pregnant in the entire sermon on the porch. And so there he was hiding something, and we know now that he was hiding that for a very real reason, a very urgent reason. And probably the crime happened in the Chris Watts case because the pregnancy needed to remain hidden, right? In Carey's case, we don't know whether there's another woman involved, but the lack of clarity about his relationship status is certainly strange. I mentioned it in a previous video that on his Facebook status he identifies as single, not even in a relationship, nothing about having a fiancé, just single. That's also very significant. What's also significant is him being single. He seems very emotional about the absence of his family, but kind of in a different way. It doesn't seem to be missing them, as just emotional about what has happened, which is slightly different. With Chris Watts, he didn't seem to be emotional at all, even though he was talking about them having an emotional argument, but he didn't seem emotional at all. Carey seems very emotional, but he also seems very over-emotional. He seems to be very burdened and unhappy, as if he knows something bad has happened. Not that he doesn't know something bad, that he does know. And at the same time, he also kind of flicks out of this mood at the drop of a hat, which is also quite strange. And so when he's asked, he answers, if he's asked, is she your fiancée? Carey answers, yes, and then he looks in the middle distance to his left. It's my fiancée, yes ma'am. Now, that is already a troubling way that he answers. It's almost like he's remembering that she is or was his fiancée. If someone asks you, is it your wife? Is it your whatever? Why wouldn't you look at the camera and just be very assertive about it? Why do you need to look down and remember that someone has that kind of attachment to you? You see what I'm talking about? And notice how he answers. He also says, it's my fiancée. Not she's my fiancée or Heidi's my fiancée. It's my fiancée. And that it's, I think, is a very serious red flag, because Heidi has been reduced to it. And that's also something I wanted to bring up, is the identity of this guy. What is his job? What does he do? He's a furniture removals guy. What do furniture removals guys do every single day? They move things around, they dispose of furniture, they collect furniture, they dismantle furniture, they take furniture apart like pieces of a puzzle, and then they put them back together and they put them in a house where they need to be. They take things out of a house and they disassemble and pack them somewhere, and then they reassemble them somewhere else and they put them somewhere else. And we heard in the previous episode just how often he mentioned this whole idea of pieces and pieces of a puzzle, and I'm concerned that there's more to it than that this is actually a reference to possibly human remains that are in pieces. Another thing that for me was a serious red flag, and again I'm just saying what it appears to be, there could be another explanation, but at just 13 seconds into the recording, the male producer seems to sort of interrupt Carey and just say to him, look, can you kind of look at the camera? I'm not sure whether he wants to look at him or his father, whatever it is, but his response is really interesting. Carey seems very, as I say, passive, but he also seems kind of vulnerable and weak and pathetic, in a way, in the sense of he's emotional and he's emotionally compromised, and yet when he's just asked a simple thing like, can you look at the camera, he's sort of defiant. He says, yeah, I look down when I talk, and I'm sorry, I'm going to look down the whole time, probably. And this is a complete stranger to him. The producer's someone he doesn't know, and his response to a simple request like just look at the camera isn't, okay, I'll try and look at the camera. He simply refuses to do it. He simply says, well, you know what, not only am I not going to look at the camera now, I'm going to look down the whole time. And I think this says a little bit about Carey's personality, that he does things the way that he wants to do them, and he expects to have his way in certain respects. If you look at his expression when he looks at the producer and you compare it to how downcast and vulnerable he was, there's a very big change there in the passive responses to the questions from the woman, and to this quite sort of confrontational response to the guy in the room. Just simply, I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. And he says he's sorry, but he still doesn't do what he's asked to do. And he doesn't seem to He says he's sorry, but doesn't seem to be very sorry about it. And so the male producer doesn't really have much to say about that. What can he say? He just says, all right. So now he's got a guy who's not going to be talking on camera or addressing the camera, which means almost everything he's saying when he's not looking at the camera can't be used on television. And then Carey swallows. And then the female reporter says, so just tell us about the day your fiancé disappeared. And then this is the part that is probably the third flag, and it happens at just 25 seconds. So in less than 30 seconds there have been three pretty serious red flags. And the flag here is that you've got a possibly completely normal thing where, bear in mind this video was shot I think the day after her disappearance, right? So it's just one day that's passed. You guys must correct me if I'm wrong. If it wasn't filmed on the Friday, let me know. But so the reporter says, tell us about the day your fiancé disappeared. If it was just such a normal day and the disappearance was kind of normal, and also bear in mind that he himself said that he took hours to start worrying about it. Like, you know, when he got home, no one was home, and it took several hours to become concerned, right? So he didn't seem very worried about it at the time. Now he's talking to the media, and then the reporter says, tell us about the day your fiancé disappeared. And what he does is, instead of doing that, I mean, that's why he's there. He's there to talk to the media, to appeal for help, supposedly. I mean, is he really there to appeal for help, or is there to appeal to the public to see him as innocent? Think about that. If he knows that something's happened to her, he's really not appealing for help. He's appealing to the public to see him as not responsible, as innocent, as being plausibly not part of some kind of plot, as not only blameless in this disappearance, but also urgently, with conviction, asking for help. But he's not. He's definitely not urgent. His answers aren't urgent. His expression isn't urgent. He's not trying to engage with his audience. He seems to be asking his audience in a passive way to accept something. That seems to be the real appeal. And so when he's asked this question, why does he just close his eyes? Bear in mind, this isn't a blink. He's not asked the question and he blinks. He literally closes his eyes. And so what he seems to be doing subconsciously there is he seems to be shutting down the gaze of people. It's almost like he's feeling the attention of the camera and of the media and of the the audience, just on the question of, tell us about the day your fiancé disappeared. And he's closing his eyes almost as a barrier to say, I want to push away what you guys are thinking, and I need to concentrate on what happened. And that could be true. It could be that he's simply very emotional, and it's the last time he saw his family. So that could be one version of it. But he seems very overwhelmed just by that simple question. Why is he so overwhelmed? Why does he need to concentrate on the version of that day that he's going to give? And this brings up the fourth red flag effectively. It's where the female reporter says, what kind of day was it? Was it a regular day? And it's unfortunate that she asked that follow-up question. If she'd simply said, what kind of day was it? That's a great open-ended question. But by reframing it, was it a regular day, she kind of leads him into answering. And that is where he perks up and he says, he opens his eyes and he says, it was just a basic Thursday. And when he sort of looks up, he's not quite looking up. He's looking down, but his eyes are very heavy lidded. It's like he's looking into memory and into the middle distance. And he seems to be choosing his words very carefully. And he refers to it as just a basic, and then he shakes his head slightly, Thursday, looking down. This is all very weird. Why can't he simply look at the camera and just say, this is the kind of day it was? Aren't you trying to convey that information? And there's a mismatch here, because something very unusual happened on that day, and yet it's just a very basic Thursday. That's the story he's telling, is that it was just a very ordinary day. And you often have this with kind of interrogations with suspects. They will tell you that everything was completely normal. So Chris Watts, for example, in his sermon on the porch, kind of conveyed the same thing. That it was a normal day. They didn't have a very unusual conversation, and Shanann just told him she's going to take the kids somewhere. It was just perfectly normal. He wasn't worried about it at all. So why are other people worried? Right? Why were other people worried and not him? And in this case as well, he doesn't get worried when he doesn't hear from her. He gets worried when other people don't hear from her. So there's something wrong with the fact that it was just a completely normal Thursday. It probably wasn't a completely normal Thursday. And then he emphasizes the word basic again by saying, we basically have a routine every day, and that's probably true. And it's also probably true that that day, that routine was different. That routine was broken. That day was unusual for very many reasons, in the same way that the day that Shanann died and the children died was also a very unusual day for Chris Watts. He was trying to make it out to be a very usual day, that he just went to work as usual, but him going to the well site wasn't usual. And you often see this in true crime, is the person being questioned will convince you that they were asleep and everything was completely normal, and they did their laundry or something, and everything that happened was absolutely normal. There was nothing that stood out. But the fact that somebody dies in these circumstances means something very unusual did happen. Very, very unusual. What they did as well was possibly very unusual. Digging a grave, transporting dead bodies is very unusual, for example, in the Chris Watts case. And so what he's trying to convince people of, again with his head down, is that they were having a usual basic day, a basic routine every day. And then he says, I get up around 6 a.m. and then he says he hits the snooze button a couple of times. He's giving completely irrelevant, useless information. And again, this is a lack of conviction. This is a lack of urgency, given that people's lives are possibly on the line and time is of the essence. And here he's talking about hitting the snooze button a few times, as if this is important. Then he says he gets up at 6:15 and he drinks some water. Again, that's completely irrelevant. It's not important what he drinks or when he drinks it or whether he brushes his teeth. And someone mentioned this reference to water. Maybe it's relevant in some way, maybe it's not. I don't want to jump the gun here, but certainly in some cases where there are murders of people close to, like family members, water is used to sort of wash away the connection, and we certainly saw that with Scott Peterson. You have the bodies literally anchored with homemade anchors and thrown into the sea. And the idea is that the sea washes the traces of this person away. And then at 55 seconds, there's a very significant change in Carey's effect. He sighs very heavily, and you can go to the blog on Crime Rocket 2 and watch the video. It's geared to open the video at that exact moment. The video link is also there. Something you should do a couple of times. Go to 55 seconds. but he sighs very heavily, and that is a subconscious reaction. That's also a very emotional reaction. And what he says when he sighs is really significant. Is he says, wake the kids around 6:30, and then he glances down and to his right, and he says, wake up Heidi and Silas right before I leave. So there's something weighing on him around this idea of when the family were supposed to wake up. Maybe it is lack of sleep. Maybe it is the sleeping arrangements. But something around trying to sleep or waking up. You know, someone has suggested that Heidi took Silas to school and then went to the book fair but left the infant at home. And what if the infant was crying and Carey still wanted to sleep, and that's why he's hitting the snooze button. He still wanted to sleep, but the snooze button maybe woke up Margot, and maybe that upset him. I don't know, that's just a scenario. But there does seem to be something that's important about sleep in this small, short snippet. And that's just 63 seconds, the first 63 seconds. And then there's another very emotional moment where Carey kind of expresses it. He even verbalizes it by going, and he sighs again. And he says, once I got them up on Thursday. So you can see there's a lot of emotion just around this idea of waking up. And then he says it was kind of later that morning. It was around 6:40 whenever I got them up. And so here he's already contradicting himself. This is actually another red flag where he's just said the morning was just like any other morning. But it's not. It wasn't like any other morning because, well, first of all, there was a new infant in the house for the past 2 weeks. So that was going to change when people woke up. But he's already just admitting that they woke up later than usual, which also seems strange. And then not only that, you also had this thing of him taking, Heidi taking Silas to school for the first time. That was also very unusual in that morning. So why is he starting off the morning, the narrative of the morning, saying that it was basically the same as any other morning? And this is something you really need to watch a few times and listen to a few times. And I'll play the clip again at the end. But he says it was Heidi's first day to actually take, and this is another red flag in terms of body language. At the time that he says it was Heidi's first day to actually take, you see a sudden change in his body language. He cocks his head, he moves, his whole body moves to the left, and he purses his lips. And it seems like there's some emotional connection to the fact that Heidi was taking Silas to school. Did he want to take Silas to school? Wasn't he happy that Silas was going to school the way that it was happening? Was he meant to take Silas to school? Were they meant to take Silas to school together? We don't know, but there's something going on there. And the cocking of his head seems to be not aggressive, but it seems to be something quite assertive that's going on there. And that is kind of to do with custody. Who's taking the child somewhere? Who is in control of the child going somewhere and being fetched from somewhere? And then when he mentions Margot, immediately after that, there's even more emotion. His body rocks, his eyes are still closed, and his voice chokes up. He says, and he's trying to speak, and he swallows hard. And then he says the words, by herself, and his head drops heavily. That's a very significant moment when that happens. There's something about Margot being by herself that is causing his head to drop down heavily. And my intuition says Margot was left at home. I've spoken to a few mothers now and asked, would you leave your child at home if your child was 2 weeks old? And a lot have said they never would. They would take them with them or whatever. And But this may be an instance where Margot was left at home so that Silas could be taken to school, and then something happened to Margot. That's one theory that's also been discussed on crimerocket2.com. And then after he's dropped his head heavily, he says, with Silas, and he clears his throat. This is a very significant moment in the first 2 minutes. And then he glances up and to his right, and then he talks about giving Heidi a kiss, the baby a kiss, and Silas a kiss. And that seems, again, to be emphasizing that he doesn't have a problem with his family. He's got a good relation with them. And all of this is within the first minute and 38 seconds. We've spent 38 minutes analyzing just 1 minute and 38 seconds. And I'm going to leave it there. If you guys want further analysis, there's some interesting body language and stuff to deal with after that. Let me know. But that's it for today. You can also head on over to my Patreon page. It's Patreon/TCRS, where I've done some psychological analysis of the dark triad and a possible psychological connection to Chris Watts in terms of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. So head on over to that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.